Well, once again, good morning. Welcome back to Captain Boat Builder. Last night the low was 27 degrees, so I'm quite happy to be here in my basement where it's nice and warm. I wanted to show you the latest progress. A couple of things I wanted to point out initially. This is the phase where you connect with glue part of the external seams between the planks. You connect them together with glue. And the reason I say partial is if you look very closely, you can see here that I have glue in the seam in between the wires. And you'll notice that there's no glue on the wires. This is very important. I have seen some videos where people have been a little bit anxious to finish and they glue the entire seam and then they effectively glue the wires into the planks, and they're very hard to get out, or you have to sand them out, which is a tremendous pain. I used thickened epoxy with the cellophil so it's clear, and you can see that we have a nice clean line here. This more filler will be added to this in the future to change the profile of this little joint. You can see it's not quite full. But today I'm going to be removing all the wires, and I'm also going to be filling in the spaces in between that are not filled now. And then after that is finished, all of the external seams will be completely glued together. I do want to show you one thing that I ran across kind of by accident, and I'm hoping that this will change. If you notice on this particular section of thin seam right here, where I've tightened the wire, you'll see that the planking is actually pulled in just a little bit. It's almost too tight. So I'm hoping that when I remove the wire, the wood will relax and then the seam will be uniform. As you can see right here, there's a irregularity in the straightness of the thin part of the planking. So I'm hoping that that will relax once I cut these wires, and I'll have an even seam all the way down. So later today, I'll let you know how the removal of the wires went and show you the final filling of the seams, and I've got just a few suggestions for you that'll make it a lot easier. So I'll be back with you in a couple of hours. Well, happy boat builders, I'm back. Several hours have gone by. I wanted to show you what I've done in preparation for the final gluing. One of the things that I did was I took all of the wires out, and as you can see now we have nice clean holes on the outside. But what I wanted to show you in particular is you're going to wind up with wires like these two right here and this one. These are the wires that on the inside they are embedded in the epoxy mixed with the wood flour, and so when you cut them off, they are not coming out because they're embedded in that epoxy mix. So no matter how close you cut them, you're going to have tiny little pieces sticking out. The instructions say just to sand them off. Well, it didn't take very long for me to figure out that the sanding did not work very well because as soon as I tried to sand them, these little wire tips are extremely sharp, and as a result I wound up cutting through my sandpaper on my sanding block almost immediately. So what I figured out was if you use a flat file like this one, see it's completely flat on one side. If you use a flat file, you can just go back and forth and you can cut these wires off, and they're just so smooth you can't even feel them. So that's my suggestion for taking care of these wires on the outside of the boat, is to use a flat file instead of trying to somehow use sandpaper. You'll also notice here that I have put masking tape on both sides of the centerline joint, and there are places like right here where the epoxy is not quite flush, and also in the bow there are places where more epoxy needs to be added to fill the end grains of the wood and fill up some of the seams. So I'll be using a chip brush to brush on thickened epoxy afterward. that'll probably be one of the last things I'll do. I wanted to show you the technique that I use for this is the technique that I use for filling up the seams. It seems to work pretty well. What I do is I use a putty knife, just a regular old putty knife like this one. I use thickened epoxy thickened with Sassafras that's fairly thick, and I'll just get just a little bit of epoxy on the tip, and then I'll go right down to the seam like this, and I'll just put it into the seam, and then I'll take the putty knife and drag it this way to smooth it out, and then we'll run it once like this to make sure that there's no epoxy on the top, and also like this to make sure that there's no epoxy on the bottom. And I do that for each section. What I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be filling in the spaces between what I did yesterday. I still have to fill this in. So what you get, you see this is, you can see this is very smooth. I have done no sanding at all, almost no sanding on this edge, and this is what I've been trying to do. Now I wanted to show you what kinds of problems you can have with this epoxy on this seam. This right here is a rough diagram of how the seams fit together. The boat is upside down, so this is actually the bottom of the boat, and this is headed towards the top side, toward the gunnel. So this is the way the seams would line up when your boat is upside down, which is the way my boat is sitting right now. So this is the seam before you do anything with it, and you can see the idea is to get it as tight as possible right here where my finger is, so that the epoxy doesn't run down and get into the boat and create a huge mess. The way that the instruction manual recommends is to use the cake decorating bag with a hole in the end of it to squirt the epoxy in, and it looks like there's a real good danger that you're going to wind up with epoxy well outside of this area. And somehow this is all going to have to be contoured and sanded, which is an incredibly slow process. So what I've done is the first step that I just tried to roughly show you gives you an epoxy level that's about like this. It doesn't quite fill up to the top. And it looks pretty much like that when you look down into the joint. And I'll show you right here. You can see how the epoxy is down in the joint just a little bit. One of the last steps you'll do is you will be making this radius right here with a little bit of epoxy thickened with wood flour. You can use a small tool to make this radius. And if you do it right, there'll probably be almost no cleanup and no sanding, as opposed to the pastry chef bag, which leads to the possibility of a huge pile of resin up here that has to be contoured. They talk about using a stick, a rounded dowel with sandpaper on it. I can see weeks of sanding. So that's why I've done this technique, where the first time around I just fill it up like this, and then at the end with the wood flour thickened epoxy and a tool, I'm going to get a nice radius like that. So that's why I've gone to this really time-consuming way of doing these seams, but I am convinced, again, that this is going to result in practically no sanding, and the sanding is what really takes the time. So I'll be filling in all of the empty spaces in the joints with fresh epoxy, painting a line of epoxy down the keel center line, and I'll be back with you in an hour or so when I'm finished, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye. Well, I'm back with you again, and I just wanted to point out today, as we get ready to close out, a couple of things that I forgot to mention. Remember I talked about the idea of the wires being so tight and actually compressing the wood. And you can see here, this is the part of wood, this is the part of the planking that I showed you before that was compressed. And now that the wire has been taken out, it's straightened out, not completely, but almost. So the wood does come back by itself. I wanted to show you that this is what the keel seam looks like after I've taken off the tape. And I also wanted to be sure and make a point of saying that when you use tape, like on the keel seam here, or in particular underneath the boat for the filleting of the bulkheads, you have to take the tape off before the epoxy sets up. Because once it sets up and the tape is now bonded to the epoxy, the sanding that's required to get that green tape off the edge is actually worse than any sanding you would have had to do without the tape. So just remember, if you're going to use tape, and it's great, I really like it, it gives you a lot of control, but you have to remember to take it off before this stuff sets up. So we'll be getting ready to close out here today, and looking forward, the next thing is to turn the boat over and start doing some work on the inside.